Welcome to another episode of Talking College Football with JJ Kitchen. Of course, I'm your host, JJ Kitchen. Guys, before we get into the big topics of today, mostly around conference realignment and the big additions to the ACC, right down below here, subscribe to the channel, like the video. More importantly, share with your friends. Certainly helps us with the algorithm and the size that we continue to keep growing. The more and more you that comment, subscribe, like the video, the more it gets out there and the more we have dialogue and conversations with more of you and more information comes, especially as we bring it to you. Guys, the big topics of today, it's almost like it was a never-ending thing, dating back to February and heck, even January, when the topics of conference realignment really started between the Big Ten and the Pac-12, and then the Big 12 adding how many months did we hear the Big 12 was going to add teams from the Pac-12? How fast is that going to happen? That took months, and now here we are. ACC dialogue for now, a little bit more than a month now, talking about the possible additions of Cal and Stanford, but potentially SMU from the American Conference. Today, that comes to fruition off of the flip of North Carolina State. Coming into this today, there was a vote this morning around 7:30 this morning here on Friday afternoon, as we talk about it here. Now, obviously, Friday this morning, there was a conversation, a vote came. There were 4 defectors early on, and really in the past month, and really in the beginning of August, where we are today now, September 1st, really as a month has gone by. The 4 defectors were Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, and North Carolina State. As you can imagine, North Carolina State were really hooked at the hip for a long time because of how they are, especially with academics being able to involve each other. Obviously, we know what's going on with Clemson and FSU. Not enough money, they thought. They want straight up media rights in terms of what this looks like in terms of growth. They wanted more money just off the bat, and we'll get a little bit more of that today. But the big topic is, it is a fact now that Stanford, Cal, and SMU have been admitted to the ACC and extended an invitation, which they are going to gladly invite and accept. Guys, what does this mean in terms of the ACC and what does it look like going forward? To me, this is a move for survival. And when you look at the conversations that each one of these conferences have had in the past, really 6, 7, 8 months, it's been very clear. You need to expand. You need to add more teams to survive. I think that, when you look at it from a perspective of, ACC fan and naturally just a college football fan in general, I love all the conferences. Preferably, I've said it from the beginning that, I don't like any of these conference moves, to be quite honest with you. I love the Power 5 the way it was. It was regional. You had certain teams, especially rivalries. We saw from the last realignment where the Big East fell, a number of conference rivals had lost a lot of limelight. The games that went away for a long time. Finally, in my instance, the backyard brawl in Pitt finally made its way back last year. Pitt winning last year in Pittsburgh. This year, Pitt heads down to Morgantown, which is going to be a great game. Harder to make those games when you're not in the same conference, but they're able to get it done. But when you look at it, you're looking at Stanford and Cal all the way over on the West Coast. It's crazy to think about. But, it's like what the Big Ten's done, adding USC and UCLA, and then eventually Washington and Oregon over on the West Coast as well. It's just the way conference realignment's going right now. It's the way college football is going right now. Do I agree with it? No. Do I hope that the conference realignment stuff stops, especially too for terms of just the sake of keeping many teams and people involved? I think that the more you start pushing people out, the less viewership you're going to get, the less money you're going to make, and the less money these players are going to make. I think that's really what it comes down to, especially when you start driving the consumer, which is really us, you, the consumer. If you drive people away from the sport, you lose viewership, you lose money. I mean, that's really the thing that comes into hand with this in terms of how can they continue to make more money, which is why all these decisions are made at this point. Conference realignment is based on money in football. That's what we do know. And of course, how can we keep people interested? That is really the biggest thing. And for my hope, I think for the lifeblood of college football and for what it is, the purity of it, you really do hope that it stops here and stops now. I highly doubt it does. I think there'll be potentially more moves to come. But this is a really big move in terms of the ACC. And one of the things that I was told about this week about why this move is so important for the ACC is, without adding without including, Notre Dame, they're at 14 schools. Okay. What people don't know is if you go under, technically, if you go under 14 schools, okay, 14 schools, you actually allow ESPN to renegotiate the grant of rights and the media rights distribution. Okay. Here's what people understand. This is definitely a move for the future. Okay. There clearly been conversations about schools potentially leaving. I don't think they're leaving for a while. And I've stated that since January. People have disagreed with me. I've been right so far. I think that the money is just hand over fist a lot. When you're looking at $420 million to $720 million to leave the conference with the buyout of the ACC plus the grant of rights, you're looking at this from a perspective of just schools can't do it. Florida State's trying to get creative, but I think they're really pushing themselves into a hole because, one, they don't understand the nature of how aggressive that they're looking right now, but in the nature of the risk that's involved, and it could plummet their university, especially with private equity. Guys, I'm in finance. I can tell you this: when that stuff came out, there's no way it takes massive ground that they go towards a private equity. I mean, for me personally, we deal with private equity on a day-to-day basis with people in our departments in the banking world. I can tell you this: that is a massive, massive upheaval in terms of what kind of risk that really takes on. And when we've done plenty of stuff with private equity, you can see over the country right now, not everything's a sure thing. If anything, there's more failures than there are successes. So that's really the main reason why I think that the ACC was adding these three teams. Obviously, SMU, they haven't been in really the limelight for 14 years, especially coming after their debacle 14 years ago. Really almost, really receiving the death penalty at a certain point. Luckily keeping their program alive through politics and what they were able to do to get out of that. Obviously it took them 14 years, but they're back in there. SMU will not be taking any distributions on this deal, which is massive to say the least. And I think that's why SMU became more attractable in this discussion. I didn't think SMU was going to make it in, especially if they wanted to share. I think if they wanted to share, they wouldn't have made it. But they're going to join the ACC with no distribution, but allowing the ACC network and ESPN to really get into the Texas market. But more importantly, the ACC network, which to this point, obviously, doesn't have anybody in Texas right now. Allows more viewership, allows more money. And as we've seen over the years, the ACC has really outgrown its distribution in terms of what the projections are. They've outgrown their projections, which is huge. I think you add in these two teams on top of, I think between Cal and Stanford, if I'm not mistaken, Cal, Stanford, and I think it's SMU too, if you add in, they have 22 billionaires between all three schools, which is mind-blowing to even think about. SMU obviously has plenty of money. The fact they're not taking distributions for 7 years, 7 years they're not taking distributions, which is crazy to think about, okay? But that goes to tell you the amount of money and donor base that SMU has currently at this point in time. Guys, they've always had money. That was never going to change. I think now getting to a Power 5 conference, I could see them getting really competitive. I really do. Because I think the competition certainly raises. They're no longer in the American Conference anymore. When you join the ACC and you join the Power 5 level conferences, where now technically going to be Power 4, we'll get into that a little bit later. But more importantly, you join a power conference like the ACC, where you're facing, the Clemsons of the world, the FSUs, the Miamis, North Carolina State, North Carolina, Pitt. When you look at these schools, even Wake Forest, when they're on the up and coming, we'll see what kind of season they have this year. They're in the ACC championship game, Miami. You're facing much better brands. You're facing much better competition. We'll see what they do. Obviously, I can assure you the NIL event that the SMU will be very strategic and one that becomes and makes them very aggressive in the market to acquire talent. As for Stanford and Cal, this was huge for them in terms of being able to just, one, be in a Power 5. They're technically Power 5 level status. They didn't want to lose that by going to the Mountain West or going to the American Conference. Either way, they really, and you could say ego got them into this point to begin with, but at the same time, though, I think it's a good move to stay in the power conferences because, one, your level of money changes drastically, okay? I know Stanford and Cal will only get a 30% share to start, but as the years go on, guys, they're going to get, it's about 5 or 10% more each year when they're in the conference each year. So at the end of the day, I think this is a good move, obviously, for Stanford and Cal and SMU. They get to join a conference in a power level, major competition, especially like the ACC. But in terms of the ACC, they're going to have this towards, each individual team in the conference will get a bump in media distribution rights. Roughly right now, if the money was spread out even, it'd be $2.5 million for each individual institution. But I think right now it's probably going to be about $1 million per institution in terms of what their conference looks like, what their media distribution looks like. And then the rest of that pot, which looks like right now about $55 to $60 million, will be put into a pot for the success initiative. So basically, the more you win, the more money you get. So for teams like Clemson, and I think it's less at Clemson, it's more of Florida State. If they want that money, you got to go win. And again, they've talked all summer. We'll see what that team looks like. They certainly have a lot of talent on their football team this year. I've done enough looking at the rosters on the ACC and what these teams look like going forward. They do have talent, as they do every year. But the difference now between Florida State is Florida State actually needs to do something. They do a lot of talking, but what they need to do now, they need to do a lot of winning now. They actually need to produce on the football field and not be mediocre. So we'll see what that looks like. In terms of what this all means now, the ACC, obviously, the $72 million, but after you cut out distributions to these teams, you cut out distributions, in terms of travel costs, it's about $55 to $60 million in a success initiative pot. But where does that leave, I think a lot of this was being really left in the dark, and people really haven't talked about this. Where does this leave Oregon State and Washington State? Guys, again, this is the part of conference realignment that's just absolutely horrendous. I just don't like it. Oregon State ranked this year in the top 25 to start the season, the preseason polls. You'll love when you look at this team, and both of these teams. They have tremendous fan bases. And I can tell you that through the Pac-12 fans that are watching this, I love always the dialogue that we have down in the comments, and the support that I've had for you guys. Guys, I feel so bad about this because, one, these are two great institutions. They're two great fan bases. At this point, honestly, I really do hope that the Big 12 or somehow, in some way, ESPN steps up and does something with the ACC, adds these two institutions, because there's no way that both of these two schools should be able to, just drop out of the Power Five or the power conferences and then really go to the Mountain West or the American Conference, which is really what's going to happen. The Pac-12 is now done. Really, it was more of Stanford. Stanford was the one that was really holding this together because of the money they have, the alumni base, the athletic sports. Overall, when you look at athletic departments, Stanford's number one, just because of their Olympic sports. Guys, I can tell you this right now, man. It would be rough to see Oregon State and Washington State enter, the group of five level, whether it's the Mountain West or the American Conference, because there's no room. George Kliavkoff, the commissioner of the Pac-12, absolutely ruined this for the Pac-12. This will be a Harvard study as we go forward about how negotiating's not done, how bad overlooking a conference can look. And it's not just George, it's the previous administration too that was in there. They had an opportunity to add Texas and to add Oklahoma years ago. They talked about how that was just not in the plans. They didn't need to do that. Guys, there'll be a 30 for 30 on ESPN, or there'll be studies, especially a Harvard study or an academia study on just how bad the Pac-12 looked in this. Just really, if you really want to look at it, it's 24-month span. I just think in the last 24 months, the Pac-12 has looked horrendous. The leadership has been horrendous. And I kind of hope that other conferences are looking at this. I really do. For example, I like the move the ACC did in terms of adding these schools, Stanford, Cal, and SMU. But overall, when I look at the leadership of the ACC, I've been a little disappointed with Jim Phillips. I really have. And obviously, Jim Phillips is the commissioner of the ACC. If you were going to add teams like this to begin with, okay, I don't know how you weren't more aggressive in adding Washington and Oregon. I really don't. I know they tried to. They talked about it. But when you're here now and you've added Stanford and Cal out there, you could have made a pot out there with Washington and Oregon. I just don't think that they were aggressive enough. I think some of these schools needed to get on board. Obviously, there was defectors. There were people that were disagreeing. But I just don't think that there was enough push from the ACC. And that starts with Commissioner Jim Phillips. I think the leadership aspect of the ACC needs to keep trending where it's going now. Okay, they got it together. But at the fact that it took this long, I think when you look at what the Big Ten did in terms of grabbing Oregon and Washington definitely played the Big Ten in terms of, hey, we'll go back to the Pac-12 and we'll accept this deal. I know for a fact they were never going to accept that deal. It was a leverage and a negotiation tactic to be able to get the Big Ten to invite Oregon and Washington and not allow them to go back to the Pac-12. But the ACC needs to continue to get aggressive. There are 18 teams now overall, 18 in terms of all athletic sports, 17 because you don't consider Notre Dame. We're going to see what it looks like over time. And what does this overall look like now that Oregon State and Washington State, from what it looks like in all intents and purposes, will go to the Mountain West is what it looks like. The Mountain West will probably be the place that it goes. That'll be the end of the Power Five. It'll be a Power Four moving forward. It'll be the SEC, Big Ten, ACC, and the Big 12. In my heart of hearts, I think that even in terms of, they talk about the Power Two in terms of what you look at in terms of play right now, I think right now it looks like, in distribution wise, it's the SEC and the Big Ten. But when it comes to production, it's the SEC. The Big Ten is just in the same realm as the ACC and the Big 12 in terms of national championships these past couple. How many since 2014? The Big Ten's only had one national champion, and that was Ohio State in 2014. That's not good enough. That's not going to cut it. That does not put you in the top echelon. Obviously, now you add in these four teams: USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington. You bring in great brands. I would put them now at number 2 in terms of the conference because of the level of competition. I think that's great. But just like any other conference, the Big Ten has the low-level guys that just will never, ever compete in that conference. And there's about, really, in this realm right now, you look at it now, there's about, 9, 10 teams in the Big Ten that will never compete in that conference. I mean, that's just a fact. Again, I was hoping, I love Matt Roll over there when what he could potentially build in Nebraska. But man, did he look? Man, this Nebraska looked horrible yesterday against Minnesota, and Minnesota didn't look very good either. So the entire Western Conference of the Western Division, I should say, the West Coast Division of the Big Ten is just an absolute joke. It's just not anything competitive. We'll see what Wisconsin does. I think it's their chance to really take over that side for this last year, and obviously next year they start where there's no divisions. But overall, when you look at these conferences, it's just such a shame it got to this point. I'm hoping for nothing but the best from Oregon State and Washington State. My heart of hearts says they're probably going to go to the Mountain West. I hope the Big 12 extends an offer because the Big 12 has already added schools that just don't bring any value to begin with. So what difference does it make now? You might as well just add those teams. They'll get pro rata for it. So you might as well just add those teams at this point because you already brought in teams that were not good at football at all. You didn't bring any major brands. The only one that I thought was a really good ad was Utah, and Utah showed that by beating Florida here this past weekend. But overall, guys, it's a shame to where it has gone to this point. I think the ACC needs to continue to be aggressive in terms of what it could do to potentially add more East Coast teams. To be honest with you, I think there's potential teams out there. They may have to go into poaching, depending upon what that looks like. If ESPN's willing to go pro rata, what does that look like in terms of how much money's there? Do they wait until someone potentially leaves? Those are the questions that will really be brought to the forefront of what this could potentially look like. But as of today, the ACC is in a great spot in terms of the teams that they've added. They've now bumped up to 18. They're following in line with the other three, the other three conferences that are there. For me, I have, clearly the ACC is the third best conference at this point now with adding these three teams. It'll be an interesting note to see where this goes going forward. What other defectors could possibly happen? Who else leaves what other conferences? Who else is going to get poached? That's the crazy thing at this point. That's where it's at. And I think the only available brands that if a conference was to get poached between the Big Ten, and here's what the crazy part is, and we'll do another video on this to not extend it out, but the Big Ten and the SEC obviously do not want anybody in the Big 12 because there's no value there. No team adds value from there. That's what we've known all along. Plenty of discussion between, obviously the ACC trying to add Cincinnati and West Virginia. For me personally, as a Pitt fan, I would like to have West Virginia in the conference so we can just guarantee a game every single year. But ACC, the ACC and the obviously ESPN had said there's no value there. The schools don't add any value, especially to to the conference in terms of distribution rates. So that's why they'll never get voted in unless ESPN changes something. But the only available brands, and there's really 7 to 10 of really big brands in the ACC for the Big Ten and the SEC. That's the only division, the only conference that's left. So we'll see what happens when teams, because obviously you'll still have teams try to leave. I think you'll still have FSU, who's clearly there. They need to get an invite first. From what I've been told, the Big Ten's really interested in like a North Carolina, a UVA, 2 schools like that, potentially Miami to get into the Florida market, not Florida State, because Florida State's not AAU. But that's where we're headed. And right now we're going to go to a Power 4, no longer a Power 5. The College Football Playoff Committee will meet this week going forward. And in my heart of hearts, they're going to change from a Power 5 now to the Power 4. So you'll have the SEC, Big Ten, ACC, and the Big 12, the champions, those 4. You'll have those 4 champions plus a group of 5 team. So you'll have 5 there. And then now you'll have 7 at large. So now instead of 6 at large, you'll be 7 at large teams. You'll have 5 conference champions, 7 at large bids. Guys, that seems pretty competitive to me. I mean, so no matter what, I mean, you're going to get the best teams in there. I mean, that's just my honest opinion. I mean, you're going to have 7 at large bids plus the conference champions. It means a lot. And then obviously, too, guys, I don't see Notre Dame joining a conference until they're actually forced to. Just my heart of hearts. I don't see them joining a conference anytime soon unless the college football playoff says, hey, you got to join because we're going to defect, because it's going to be happening. The college football playoff is going to leave the NCAA because it's the NCAA is a horrendous organization that just shouldn't be there. We shouldn't be following their rules to begin with because they're out of touch. They're horrendous, especially between players that can play and who can't play. The NCAA is horrendous. So they'll leave the NCAA pretty soon. And then that will bring the question, does Notre Dame have to join a conference? And guys, in my prediction, I think if the college football playoff breaks away from the NCAA, you're going to see Notre Dame in a conference pretty soon. And that's just my opinion, that they're going to have to. And I think that the college football playoff is going to strong arm them, is what it is. But as long as teams are now, as long as we're all with the NCAA, I don't see Notre Dame joining a conference. Not until the college football playoff breaks apart from the NCAA and then creates their own thing, which then bringing Notre Dame along and having them join a conference. So, guys, that's our content today. Please subscribe down below, like the video, comment, share. Let me hear your thoughts. What do you think about the ACC, Oregon State, and Washington State? What do you think is going to happen to them? What other defectors could potentially come? What's going to happen to Notre Dame? Does college football playoff break away sooner than I believe and break away from the NCAA? Do they stay with the NCAA? Let me hear your thoughts down in the comment section. As always, guys, I love hearing your thoughts. Again, thank you for all your support. The program and the podcast has grown instrumentally and exponentially because of you guys and the hard work you guys put in. But more importantly, your viewership and your comments and your ideas truly help me out. So again, guys, as always and forever, hail to Pitt. But more importantly, God, you got to love college football. I'll see you guys around.